Good afternoon, Rochester community. My name is Dr. Carlos M. Cotto Jr., and I am the Executive Director of Health, PE, and Athletics for the Rochester City School District. I would like to welcome you all to today's Wellness Fair and would like to thank both Donald Hunter and Walter Larkin for sharing this vision with our team. I would like to also thank all of those that are on with us today. We have a wealth of knowledge, and we're hoping that those of you that are on Facebook or YouTube can will take advantage of this opportunity that we have for today. The Rochester City School District is hosting today's Wellness Fair in collaboration with the City of Rochester and the My Brother's Keeper initiative. The RCSD and the city has collaborated with a number of community organizations to highlight the importance of health and wellness. This is an opportunity for people of color to receive life-changing knowledge from professionals in the medical field who share in the Black and Brown life experience. Today's Wellness Fair will feature presenters from an array of professionals in the medical field who will share information and insight on a variety of mental, physical, and health topics such as racism, implicit bias, diet and nutrition, exercise, preventative screening, relationships, cultural norms, and the various mental and physical effects of the current COVID-19 pandemic. The RCSD connection to this Wellness Fair stems from its involvement in fatherhood engagement summits. These are events where the district partnered with a number of community organizations to offer unique networking opportunities to young men of color. Examples have included DJ Mixers and fatherhood engagement. We provided an NFL Pro Bowl edition in 2020 where fathers, grandfathers, uncles, and young men of color watched the game together in an opportunity for fellowship. This year's Wellness Fair takes an extra significance since it is being held on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Additionally, this event is being recognized by the National MBK Keeper Day, by the National My Brother's Keeper Day of Service program. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to share a few quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. At this time, I would like to introduce Ray Marlise, Director of My Brother's Keeper on the city, within the City of Rochester. Ray Marlise, it's yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our MBK Wellness event. I am so elated today. I'm going to start off by saying a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And that is exactly what we, My Brother's Keeper, are living by, is what we are doing for others. What we are doing for our young men of color in these times. What paths will we set for them? What resources will we provide for them? This is one of those platforms that we are reaching out to our young and boys and young men of color by providing this platform to talk about wellness and talk about issues regarding mental health, the COVID-19 pandemic. We have an esteemed panel for you, and I am going to just continue on and start by introducing our guest today, Mr. Eric Stevens. As the parent engagement specialist for Healthy Kids, Eric provides technical assistance and support to schools and neighborhoods to strengthen and improve family engagement efforts. He also works directly with parents and youth to train them on advocacy and connect them to opportunities to impact policy, systems, and environmental change. Eric is active in the community. He is a member of the United Parent Leaders Network Policy Team, Parent Engagement Collaborative Action Network of Rock the Future, the Rochester City School District Special Education and Parent Advisory Council, and also the Horizons at Harley School Parent Advisory Council. He also serves as co-chair for Rochester's PLTI, Parent Leadership Training Institute, the Civic Design Team. Prior to coming to Common Ground Health, Eric was a youth development worker for the Rochester Public Library. Eric is married with 4 beautiful children and lives in Rochester's historic 19th Ward neighborhood. His hobbies include thrifting, which we learned today what thrifting was, baseball, going to movies, and spending time with family and friends. I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Eric Stevens, who will be sharing his life's turning point. Please help me welcome Eric Stevens, and don't forget, we are streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, so please share those links and enjoy. Eric Stevens.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you so much for asking me to share my personal story with you guys today. Well, what if we lived in a society where the physical and mental health for people of color was a priority, where we had trusting relationships with our primary providers? Mental health counseling was seen as a must rather than a taboo. And us as Black and brown men were willing to share our failures and seek mentorship during physical and mental trauma. My childhood story isn't uncommon. A young Black boy raised by a single mother, I grew up in subsidized apartments, and I had few, if any, positive adult role models in my family. Sadly, in Monroe County, this story is far too common. 75% of African American children live in single parent homes. That's almost 10 points higher than the national average. And more likely than not, those parents, mostly mothers, are probably like my mom, struggling to put food on the table, desperately seeking safe neighborhoods to live in, trying to maintain reliable transportation, and wanting their children to attend quality schools. These stressors drove my mother to alcohol and drug abuse and a series of abusive relationships. My sisters and I felt the aftermath of my mother's stress. The absence of loving, supportive, and nurturing adults from the time we were infants only magnified our childhood trauma. At Common Ground Health, where I serve as the agency's parent engagement specialist, we are working with a wide variety of community partners to address childhood trauma by educating the community on the importance of infant early childhood mental health. You might ask yourself, what is infant early childhood mental health? I know I did when I was first introduced to this term. I actually even pictured a baby laying on a psychiatrist's couch, but I can assure you that it's not that. Infant early childhood mental health is asking every adult in our community to put children first by raising the awareness of the importance of providing children with loving and supportive adult relationships. Frederick Douglass said it best: it is easier to raise strong children than to repair broken men. There's a direct correlation with a child's mental health and a healthy adult life. Not only was my childhood littered with mental health stressors, but my physical health struggled as well. We didn't see doctors on a regular basis, and I remember going to the dentist only a handful of times in my childhood. Our medical services were provided primarily by Medicaid clinics, where a good number of the providers were med students themselves, and we often saw a different provider at every visit. While my white classmates had established pediatricians to make sure their BMI was on track, and experienced dentists and orthodontists that ensured pearly white teeth and a mouthful of metal with colorful rubber bands would perfect their smile. I didn't grow up with a doctor that knew me, that looked like me, or whom I had a trusting relationship with. Lacking that relationship with my primary provider didn't allow for the difficult conversations doctors often have with their patients. Perhaps more importantly, it didn't instill in me the importance of having a primary care provider and the value that comes with that authentic connection. Now, I want to take a second to pause a resource that we have here in Rochester, one that could be duplicated in any city. Rochester's Black Physicians Network is working to change that issue. The Black Physicians Network has a database of Black and brown doctors to help address that very issue. And we're fortunate to have a group working on that issue. My sisters and I battled weight issues throughout our childhood. Our diet consisted of processed foods, too many starches, and not enough vegetables. Today, people joke and call them struggle meals. But for us, mac and cheese, hot dog on white bread with mustard and corn was in daily rotation. I'm sure you have similar stories that you could share. But in all seriousness, for so many families in the city of Rochester, this problem has only increased because many of the grocery stores have fled the city limits. And the only options for communities are corner stores. And these corner stores have created food swamps that have flooded neighborhoods with unhealthy foods with little to no access to fresh fruit and vegetables. Thankfully, and I'll share with you another resource, FoodLink in Rochester is working to address this very issue by creating the curbside market. This bus travels to some of Rochester's most underserved communities and provides weekly access to fresh fruit and vegetables with the goal of increasing healthy options for family. My mom did the best she could in a system that was designed to keep Black and brown families in poverty, in poor health, and undereducated. Systemic racism wasn't in our vocabulary in the 80s and 90s. Although we knew it existed, no one talked about it, or there wasn't a word to describe it. Systemic racism is a key driver in the life expectancy of Black and brown people, which is more than 5 years shorter than our white neighbors. In my own life, like so many, I was terrified to open up about the struggles in my life. The unwillingness to talk to anyone only made the obstacles in my life more challenging to overcome. But 2020 was a year where every unhealthy aspect of my life was exposed, and I was forced to address them. My weight had been creeping up steadily for years. I gained 5 to 7 pounds a year, but it didn't seem like a lot until you multiply that by 23 years. I had ballooned to over 380 pounds. I didn't have a primary doctor that I had a relationship with that could challenge me and give me the tough talk I needed, that I was destined for certain death if I continued on this path. And if I'm going to be honest, I had given up on life. I had accepted the fact that I would die before I turned 60. What was happening on the inside was far worse than my outward appearance. I was engaging in multiple self-destructive activities, battling with low self-esteem and borderline depression. I became a master of masking my own pain. I wasn't the father my children needed. I wasn't the spouse that I promised my wife that I'd be. And I had given up on many of my educational and career goals. I was alive, but I quit living until one day everything bubbled to the top. I couldn't hide it anymore. I couldn't shove my failures back into the closet. I couldn't sweep them back under the rug either. And believe me, I tried. I wasn't ready for it, but it was my come to Jesus moment. It was my turning point. I didn't know where to go or who to ask for help. I'd been arrogant for so many years. I didn't believe I needed anyone. But at the same time, I knew I didn't have any answers. I decided to reach out to my minister and a mental health counselor in our community. And sadly, it's still a taboo to seek mental health services. You know, the saying, all you need is Jesus. I feel pretty confident that Jesus would encourage me to seek both him and mental health services. It was one of the best decisions I've ever made. Working with a professional that gave me strategies to deal with my challenges was refreshing and allowed me to see a ray of light for the first time in a long time. I then reached out to several older men that I had great respect for, and I humbly asked them if they could mentor me. I'd never asked anyone that before, and I was afraid that they'd be too busy, but they were more honored than I was humbled to be a part of my health and life journey. I then leaned on my friends. I opened up and allowed myself to be vulnerable. This was new territory because you don't share your failures with other men. And crying, which I do a lot of, is a definite no-no. But if I was going to become the best version of myself, I had to do this. Well, one of those friends is Dr. Marcus Burrell, and Dr. Burrell will be speaking with you later this afternoon. My family needed me to live a healthy life where my spiritual health, my physical health, and my emotional health was a priority. They needed me to find honor and purpose in my life again. They needed me to be on this earth longer than the 60 years I had already accepted would be my max. Since June 2020, I've lost 140 pounds. I feel better than I have in decades, both emotionally and spiritually. But I'm still on that journey, but I know I'm going in the right direction. I wish I could tell you that everything is going exactly the way I want things to go, but we would all know that that wouldn't be the truth. My family is still struggling to find balance. I see it most in my young children as they deal with the aftermath of my failures. But it's up to us to break generational curses, and we can do it. So my challenge for you today is take the necessary steps in your life to help yourself become the best version of you. And I want you to know that you're not alone. You have an army of brothers in Rochester that are here for you. Dr. Carlos Cotto, Tony Jordan, and Ray Miley's lead Rochester's My Brother's Keeper initiative, and they are creating a coalition of men that are committed to building up each other, and I'm honored to be a part of that work. I want to say thank you for listening to my story. I hope you can find some of your own struggles in my story and also see that there's an opportunity for you to make a change. Reach out to someone, reach out to us, reach out to a family member. I know that you can become the best version of yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, my brother Eric, for sharing this personal story. I mean, you are an inspiration to us all. And we will continue this brotherhood, my brother, and we'll work together as we continue to move forward. So thank you so much for your story.
Thank you, Carlos.
As we transition, I have the privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Clark. So as I start here, as Senior Health Advisor, Dr. Clark provides strategic counseling to Common Grounds initiatives from a medical perspective. A practicing physician and longtime advocate for health and equity in our community, Dr. Clark brings to her position more than 2 decades of experience in occupational and preventative medicine. With a focus on substance use disorder, Dr. Clark is a research assistant professor in the SUNY Buffalo's Department of Epidemiology in Environmental Health and Public Health, and an adjunct assistant professor in public health science at the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. Prior to joining the Common Ground staff, Dr. Clark served Common Ground as a clinical advisor and as a member of the Community Technology Advisory Board. She was a member of the African American Health Coalition for 18 years, including serving as co-chair. Dr. Clark has chaired the annual Faith and Medicine Conference and is a co-founder and board chair of the Black Physicians Network of Greater Rochester, which supports efforts to reduce health disparities, mentors medical students, and raises money for scholarship. Dr. Clark earned her medical degree from the University of Virginia, her master's degree in epidemiology from SUNY Buffalo, and her bachelor's degree in biology from Brown University. She is board certified in occupational medicine and in general preventative medicine and public health. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Clark, and she'll be focusing in the area of COVID-19 and the basics. We will be expanding this conversation a lot deeper because there's so much to be shared. So we will be putting something together come February to go a little deeper into this. So Dr. Clark, it is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Eric, it is a privilege and an honor to follow you, my coworker. Your journey is personal, and it's really touched me personally, as well as I'm sure most of the listening audience. So thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID. And it truly is a little bit, because I'm going to do a kind of a COVID 101 in 10 minutes. So bear with me. And as Dr. Cotto said, we're going to do a future presentation with our Deputy Commissioner of Health, Dr. Maria Elena Velez de Brown. And so I'm looking forward to that. But today is a quick overview. So as we all know, COVID-19 is caused by the coronavirus, and maybe not all of us knew. And the coronavirus is round, and hence the name corona, and it comes from a family of viruses that we've seen before. This is called a novel or a new coronavirus, and it's really attacking our community and our nation and our world in a way that none of us have ever seen before. I am putting the picture up just because I'm sure a lot of people have seen pictures of it, but just keep in mind those little spike proteins all around the virus, because that is a clue to how we're going to fight the virus. So as I said, the coronavirus causes the disease COVID-19. And COVID-19 may show itself in many different ways. Some people may have no symptoms at all, which is the scary thing, because they can pass the disease along not knowing that they are even sick or carrying the virus. But sometimes it may look like something as simple as a cold, but other times something so severe that lands people in the hospital. So typical symptoms might be cough, shortness of breath, a little trouble breathing, fever, chills, aches, muscle aches, headaches, GI symptoms like vomiting or diarrhea, and then a new loss of taste or smell. And that's been one of the things that's a real tip-off. When people have that one, that is very, very associated with this novel coronavirus. I'm just throwing, I love to do data, but I'm not going to do data today. But I just want to talk about the inequalities that we're seeing with COVID. And I think a lot of people have heard in the news as the epidemic was starting, that it was disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities. And what we're seeing on this slide is adjusted rates, so that we're looking as though all populations were equal in size. We see that the case rate is much higher for Black and Latino people in Monroe County. So our graph all the way to the left, the dark blue are white, non-Hispanic people, and then the green are Black, and then the gray is Latino. And as you go to the middle graph, you see again, a disproportionate in that way more Black people and Latino people are hospitalized with COVID-19. And then to the far right, the death rate is over twice as much. Now this data is getting a little stale. This is at the end of November. So when Dr. Velez de Brown comes back, we can refresh that and talk some new numbers. So how do we prevent the spread of this disease? You've heard the messaging, but I want to say it again. Staying 6 feet apart at least. And you still wear your mask, even though you're 6 feet apart, okay? Washing your hands often, soap and water for at least 20 seconds. And I found out how hard that was when we lost our hot water this weekend. It was a very brittle 20 seconds, and we can always use hand sanitizer as well. So I think my slides are a little out of order, but what are some of the myths that were going around about how to prevent COVID? We're hearing things like, oh, you drink hot liquids, that'll keep COVID down. Oh, COVID is nothing more than a bad cold. Oh, COVID's an equal opportunity disease. And in some ways that's true, because we're not sure who will be impacted by COVID. But from the data I showed you, it's not hitting our communities equal. This is one I did want to talk about. People are thinking, oh, I'm gonna go get a COVID test, and if it's negative, that means I can hang out with my friends, and that is not true. Sometimes we are carrying the disease before the COVID test becomes positive, and we've seen that. Other people get infected because we think we're negative, and we're still passing along the disease. How else do we prevent the spread? We wear masks, okay? And I'm putting some of this stuff because it's like a pet peeve. I've seen like plastic masks. Obviously, you can't have that fitting over your face. That makes it hard to breathe. That's uncomfortable. I've seen these masks with exhalation valves. That's not helping anybody else. If you've got the virus and you're breathing it out through those valves, that's not helping the rest of us. And then those N95s, they really don't work well if they're not fit to your face. So you shouldn't just pick one up offline and put it on and think you're being protected, because you're not, because the virus particles will get in when you think they're not. So you need to wear the routine masks, the procedure mask and the cloth masks, and that's fine. So how else do we prevent the spread? The new vaccine. And that will prevent the spread, and it'll prevent your own infection. I know we'll have a lot of questions, a lot of things to talk about with the vaccine, but I do want to make sure people understand just a few things. COVID-19 vaccines cannot give you COVID-19. There is no live virus in these vaccines. They cannot give you COVID-19. It will not change your DNA. People hear, oh, this messenger RNA technology, and we can talk about that more in the future, but it doesn't change your DNA. It does not get into the nucleus, the control center of your cell. It does not. There's no microchips in the serum. Bill Gates is not implanting anything in you to follow you. It is not specifically made to make Black and brown people sick. It is, this is not a myth. It is safer. Oh, it is a myth that people think it's safer just to get COVID than to get the vaccine. And when you've seen a young people who's had a stroke because of COVID, you understand that a vaccine is a way better way to go than taking a gamble and hoping that you don't get very sick from COVID. So, what kind of things have you heard? I think, it's time to, have that discussion, but have the discussion with people who can truly answer your questions. I think, a lot of times we rely on our fallbacks, Facebook, and people who have heard things, but sometimes you need to talk to your doctor, talk to your healthcare provider. If you have questions, bring it to the healthcare provider so that they can answer it. If you're doing some of your own research, try some trusted websites like the CDC, the New York State Department of Health, our own county Department of Health, if you're looking for information. I'm promoting myself here, and Dr. LeBlanc will be coming on here later, but we have a show called Mythbusters that we regularly bust myths about not only COVID, but other things. So I like to think I'm trusted. And then, really be careful about where you get your information. Not everybody who's talking really has the knowledge, really understands the problem. Social media is not always correct. And be wary of the person who never says, I don't know, or I need to look it up, or I'm not sure. Be careful. So the Black Physicians Network is another source of trusted information. We recently convened a technical advisory committee to issue a consensus statement about the vaccine. So stay tuned to that. Common Ground Health, we're creating a speakers bureau so that, if you need somebody to speak, that you can get a trusted speaker through our speakers bureau. So that's just a few examples. There are lots of different community resources that are indeed trusted, but just be careful. So that is just a really very quick overview of COVID-19. I know there's so much more we could talk about, but I just want to bring it to you quickly, whet your appetite so we can come back for a little bit more. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Clark. We appreciate it. We hope that everyone got your message. Please use reliable resources for information. We are blessed in this community to have people like Dr. Clark who is willing to get that information out. So please get the information from the right resources. Our next presenter is Dr. Burrell. Dr. Burrell attended the University of Pittsburgh, where he completed his thesis in computational neuroscience, building a mathematical computer network model of the Parkinson's disease in the Department of Mathematics. He graduated in 2007 with his bachelor's degree of science in neuroscience and a minor in chemistry. Dr. Burrell was accepted to the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry in 2008. By second year of training, Dr. Burrell had developed a deep passion for African American and minority health. He was encouraged by his instructors to apply for the National Institute of Mental Health funded program of research and innovation in disparities of education, fellows. During his fellowship training, he studied history and social impact of race and poverty in Rochester. He learned how to foster and nurture community partnerships, designed and co-led research efforts, and partnered with in partnerships that would ultimately benefit our neighborhoods. Dr. Burrell graduated with his doctorate of medicine from URSMD in 2013, but he behooved by his passions for mentoring, teaching, and research to continue his work in minority mental health and psychiatry. Based on his experiences with the community engagement and activism, during his fellowship, Dr. Burrell decided to found his first consulting business, biophysical, social, emotional, behavioral, and educational solutions. Oh man, Dr. Burrell, you doing it. Dr. Burrell is currently earning his Executive Master's of Business Administration as a part of the RIT online EMBA program, learning to transition his business into a company blending technology and psychiatry of science and justice. Once again, I'd like to introduce Dr. Burrell, who will focus on mental health today, racism, and implicit bias. Thank you, Dr. Burrell.
Thank you, Tony. Just hearing the name of my business makes me think I need to do an adjustment. It's a mouthful, but I am happy to be here, and I'm happy to share this moment with you all. So what we are going to do today is a little bit different from normally. I could share slides with you, but actually, I want to cover the topic of implicit bias through stories. So I'm going to be sharing 3 different stories with you about Black men here in Rochester. And by the end of it, my aim is to be able to create a better picture of how racism, structural, self-directed, for example, or overt and covert expressions ultimately affect our mental health. So let's start with the first story. A young Black man just recently married is on the way to get his car inspected. But little does he know that his car, unfortunately, has already is past due. He's pulled over by a police officer who just simply asks for his license and his registration, and he waits. And he waits. Suddenly, the police officer comes back and he asks, "Do you mind stepping out the car?" The Black man asks, "Am I being arrested?" And he says, no, we just need to step out the car. And he opens the door, fully trusting this man. In the very moment that he puts his foot on the ground, handcuffs are thrown around his wrists, and he's put in the back of the police car. This is done to him in the presence of his newlywed wife, and she's left not knowing what to do with the situation. So I want you all to take a moment and put yourselves in the position of that young husband and wife. And I'm going to introduce a concept to you. This concept is called the existential threat. Now, the term existential, just so you know, is concerning the idea of our actual existence. So a threat to that existence is something that may actually threaten to end our lives or threaten our way of being. In this time of COVID, necessarily, we are facing another, what would be existential threat. COVID, to some people, is this elusive idea. We don't fully know what it looks like. We know it makes people sick. And therefore, what we don't know might actually make us fearsome. So this would be posed as an existential threat. Recently, in the Rochester community, sadly, we witnessed the passing of Daniel Prude. And when Daniel Prude passed away, it brought to our doorsteps that the racial injustices in our communities are still very alive and present. I would propose that just like COVID, that racism is, well, a threat to our mere existence living in black and brown bodies. Take that in the context of COVID and the social isolation protocols. And we have a certain recipe for exacerbating mental health conditions. Now, sadly, what we see is that when individuals are faced with high levels of isolation, as we've observed during this COVID crisis, sadly, we see, like I said, the prevalence of mental health disorders increasing. Now, we return to this idea of an existential threat. And I want you to now think of it as a boogeyman. And now think about yourself and your black and brown bodies being haunted by a boogeyman that we don't know, we can't see, but we know is always over our backs and looking over our shoulders. This, my friends, is sadly the reality of many of us here in Rochester, regardless of our race, class, and gender. Now think back to the story. What made the officer throw the handcuffs on this individual? It's not necessarily clear, and unfortunately that man was never told why he was just thrown in the back of the police car. But I would propose that just like we experience racism and COVID as boogeymen, we sadly are also seen as boogeymen to the other groups and racial ethnicities in this world. We all could relate to being followed around in a store or people clutching their purses tight merely when we walk around. So if we are seen as boogeymen and we are also haunted by our own boogeymen, what do we do? In the case of the police officer, you would do what anyone would do to the threat of your own well-being. Just like COVID, we isolate, contain, and in the case of the police officer, we detain. But in our positions and social positions as Black and brown individuals, we don't necessarily have that luxury. So we'll delve deeper into what we can necessarily do to deal with the boogeyman hanging over our backs. Now, with that being said, I want to introduce a second story to you. This is about another Black man awaiting the birth of his first child. Sadly, he's been waiting. He and his wife have been waiting for this day for years and years, and finally conception was successful. They've gone about all the stores, looking at all the furniture and set up this beautiful house. And the dad even brought clothes because he was going to go home in the same outfit as his son. Approximately 17 hours before delivery was expected to be induced, something goes wrong. And an emergency C-section now has to be performed. The son lets out a cry, and after that, it's silence. An hour passes, and the family now learns that their son is no longer with them. So what do we do? What is this man to do, having to console his wife and experiencing the loss of opportunity to bring a young boy into the world? I mention this story because we are now going to talk about the idea of hope and when hope turns into loss. Sadly, when we experience the effects of systemic racism, overt and covert displays, so racism being in your face, or getting the sense that someone may have prejudices towards you, but not necessarily expressing them, we, as individuals, as Black people, the data has shown, can sometimes take on a position in life known as learned helplessness. And the narratives that we begin to tell ourselves become increasingly negative to the point that we experience losses of self-esteem and a sense of loss of control over our own lives. Sadly, this is actually a prevalent occurrence in the Black and Brown experience. Now, what necessarily causes racial discrimination to be so prevalent? The question is, what are the social conditions? That's what we want to look at. What are the people around us doing in our lives to make racism a very acceptable, particularly in these environments, practice? Now, the research is showing that it's not necessarily the actors who play out racist behaviors that make it more acceptable. It's actually the passive bystanders that do nothing. You see, racism is actually rests in the bosom of implicit bias. And in order for implicit bias to thrive, we need conditions that unfortunately allow us not to be seen as humans anymore. What standing on the sidelines does is it normalizes this dehumanization of our Black and Brown experiences. And as we do this, there's no stops or checkpoints for conditions of racism to no longer thrive in our societies. They become infiltrative in all the areas of our lives. This Black man losing his son unexpectedly is experiencing hope and loss, much like the individuals who are the victims of systemic racism every day, losing opportunities to advance in lives, opportunities to make money, and opportunities to even eat at the same cafeterias. So I want to shift to the third story. Excuse me, sorry. In the context of civil rights and civil unrest, like we've seen here in Rochester, the question is, what is it that we are fighting for? When it comes to civil unrest, we're pushing against authorities that threaten to dehumanize and take away our rights to exist and our rights to personal safety. Now, in the context of the larger picture of Black experience, what do we necessarily do when those individuals who we are pushing back are every bit as resistant as our cries for equal treatment in the world? Where do we look in order to enact change in our lives when the structures appear built up against us? Well, I would suggest that we actually begin looking inwards. We look towards each other and we look at our own stories. In the story of this third Black man, he's now spent 1 year grieving the loss of his child and comes to a realization that he wants to live a life honoring that individual. He moves on and builds a healthy, loving relationship with his wife and eventually gives birth. His wife gives birth to two beautiful daughters, one looking just like his beloved son. He decides that despite the hurt, pain, and trauma in his life, that he wishes to control the narrative and tell his own story and write how this traumatic story ends. He's now in control. So how do we go about doing that? How do we fight racism, as I asked before, and how do we fight systems that seem resistant to change? In order to do this, we can't necessarily correct behaviors, okay? Instead of correcting behaviors, we need to now change thoughts. And how do we do that? Well, as we mentioned before, we need to restore the humanity that we see in individuals and in ourselves. How do we restore that humanity would then be the next question. I would suggest that we embrace the power of story. Why is story so appealing? What's the purpose of story? Story, before the written record was created, was used to transmit information and transmit ideas across cultures throughout time. However, as we have become more advanced civilizations, my question now is this to you. With the advent of the internet and data literally at our fingertips, why do stories still exist? Because stories tap into something that is far deeply seated in us all. Story is able to awaken emotions in us that, despite all our appeals and beliefs that we are rational human beings, we at the same time are still governed by the same basic desires to live, sleep, feed, seek comfort, shelter, just like our common man. Story taps into this emotional DNA, as we'll call it. Story allows us to make sense out of narratives that don't originally seem to be fitting together. Story allows us to reclaim a life and to establish our lives with purpose and visibility between one and another. So what does that look like? Now, I mentioned up front that I was taking a non-traditional approach, not picking PowerPoints, and instead I wanted to share stories with you. And the reason for this is this: because these stories are actually about me. Excuse me. These stories are my stories. Yes, I'm a doctor. Yes, I've studied. I've read lots of books. But at the end of the day, I'm a human just like you. I experience triumph and tragedy like everyone else. And I encourage all of us, particularly in this time of COVID, to tap into this shared humanity. Now, what does this have to do with implicit bias? Like I said, this is the antidote to implicit bias I propose. Because implicit bias thrives on our inabilities and refusals to see the humanity in one another. We make snap judgments about who that next person sitting next to us in the cafeteria or the man sitting across the street for us. We tell entire narratives about their life story without ever knowing them. And what that does, although it serves its purpose of a verbal shorthand, a mental shorthand, and how we can take in all the different informations bombarding us day to day, what we fail to do is acknowledge the life and the identity of other individuals. And this is what story is capable of doing. It reestablishes our sense of humanity. I would encourage you all to follow the maxim that you must dance with those who brung you. In other words, we need to wrestle, grapple, and accept the tragedies and hardships in all of our lives, because this is a shared human experience. And when we are able to do this, we are able to become the authors of the final chapters of our lives. We all are subjected to systemic racism and visible barriers to our own personal success and the right to thrive and prosper in our communities. If we are, as I said before, are unable to shift the levers of change, to change communities, what are we left to do but to turn towards each other? I want to offer one last tip. The reason I gave you this particular order of stories is because what I wanted you to do was go through a series of emotions and follow the journey of an individual. From a neuroscience perspective, when you place yourself in the minds and bodies of that husband and wife, you're experiencing a rush of adrenaline. I imagine some people, much as myself, was feeling cloudiness and confusion and my heart rate racing, not knowing what was being done. The officer barked at my wife and refused to tell me what I was being detained for. Fortunately, I'm still here and the story ends well. However, if you think of your loved ones, now think and feel what your body feels. This is what adrenaline feels like. Next, we told you a story of my tragic loss of my son. And the purpose of this story is to create emotional buy-in. When you learn about the tragedies and hardships of other people, we are able to transcend the shorthands of implicit bias and to begin to see the humanity in one another. From a neuroscientific standpoint, this is what they call, the cuddle hormone, or oxytocin. And lastly, we told you a story of hope and growth and a new path in an individual's life after tragedy, after my tragedy. Now, that story is still in their making. But that's the interesting thing about dopamine. While we typically think of dopamine as the feel-good, pleasure-seeking neurotransmitter, dopamine is far more profound than that. Dopamine is actually more strongly linked to the anticipation of a reward than the actual reward itself. So what does this mean in the context of story and combating implicit bias? It means that as we take the time to claim our stories and own our own struggles, that rather than seeing the manifestation of all of our hard work and the success and happiness that comes with that, we actually hunger for greater challenges and a desire to move forward. We move forward with a sense of self-efficacy and self-control and a belief in our own destinies. We are able to celebrate ourselves. This is the crux of fighting implicit bias. Implicit bias is very real, and it's here all the time. Sadly, based on the name implicit, means we don't necessarily see this. It just plays out in the tapes of everyone's minds. We all have it. You may be exercising it towards me right now. But as I shared my story with you, I encourage you all to share your story with others. Because as we do this, we can build an insulated community that is resistant to the shame and physical threats to our very existence are existential threats. When we rely on each other and bear witness to what we have experienced in our lives, we collectively can also come together and move forward as a community and write and be the authors, be the authors of our final chapters. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Burrell for his time and presentation. And I hope that we were all able to understand a little bit more about how implicit bias affects us, our mental health, as we gather our story. So thank you, Dr. Burrell. At this time, I get to introduce one of our bright young men in the community, Yabnel Cost Torres. He's a freshman at MCC. He's a recent graduate of Monroe High School. He's also an MBK fellow. And I don't see him on the screen yet, but at this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Yabnel Cost Torres.
Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Jordan. Thank you guys for having me here. And I want to apologize for any background noises, but now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Calvin L. Cole, who is a research assistant professor in the Center for Musculoskeletal Research at the University of Rochester Medical Center here in Rochester, New York. His laboratory's focus is identifying the mechanism of cancer-related muscle wasting and associated treatments. He also spearheads the Center for Human Athleticism, Musculoskeletal Performance and Prevention, CHAMP, otherwise known as CHAMP, program, which seeks to reduce the prevalence and risk of injury in underrepresented adolescents, students, athletes, while improving academic, behavioral, and overall health outcomes. He is also a lecturer for the Cell Biology of Disease PhD program, in which he focuses on the topics related to physical activity, exercise, and nutrition. Introducing Dr. Cole, who will focus on physical health in the areas of diet, nutrition, exercise, stretching, screening, and the effects of COVID-19. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for that introduction, Mr. Yabnel. Again, my name is Calvin Cole, and I am a researcher at the University of Rochester. I want to start by thanking my brother's keeper for giving me this platform to speak and to educate the community, because indeed I do believe that the ills that face our community should primarily be addressed from within. And until we as a community begin to try to heal from within, I don't think there's very much that populations outside of our community can do for us. So what I'm gonna do for you today is I'm gonna talk to you. I'm gonna share my screen real fast here. I'm going to discuss with you the benefits of physical activity and nutrition on obesity and related diseases. And when I say related diseases, I'll refer to those as comorbidities of obesity. And I just want to start by saying that I don't want this to be a talk that has negative connotations associated with it. It's an attempt at education. It's a time for education for our community. Also, at no time in this talk am I attempting to compare any race or culture, but I do want to give an overall encompassing view of obesity and the impact that it's having on us as a society, but primarily us as a community. So just to give you a little background on it, obesity is a growing epidemic in the United States. It is an epidemic at this point, and has been a growing epidemic since the onset of the technological age, in which we've seen a grave reduction in physical activity. Obesity is associated with increased mortality, and it elevates the risk of contracting other diseases. And that's why it's so important for us to get this disease under control, primarily for our community, in which we are at a greater risk, not only for obesity, but for diseases that are associated with obesity, And I think that these things can be addressed by education and a better understanding of the vessels that we refer to as our bodies. So what are my objectives for today? My objectives for today are to describe the impact of obesity on the minority population specifically, and then discuss healthy eating habits and physical activities as viable treatment options and preventative measures for obesity and comorbidities related to obesity. So how do we clinically assess obesity, overweight, or obesity? Well, when we're dealing with large populations, we do it via body mass index. And you can calculate your body mass index by taking your weight in kilograms and dividing it by your height in meters squared. That's something that you can do in your home. And then when we find BMI, we classify a person as normal weight, overweight, or obese in terms of this BMI. So a BMI that is between 25 and 29.9 would be defined as overweight. Anything under 25 would be normal weight. And then obesity, anything above, equal to or above 30 would be classified as obese. And then that classification could be further broke down into 3 classifications. And those classifications are important because as a person, as your BMI increases, so does your risk of other diseases, including mortality or death. We can also define your health risk by using your waist circumference. So a male would be deemed high risk for developing other diseases that has a waist circumference over 40 inches. And then a female would be at a higher risk for other diseases with a waist circumference of 35 or higher. We can also use body fat percentage, although there is currently no agreement on optimal health that's associated with body fat percentage. Research suggests that men should stay between 10 and 22%, and women should stay between 20% and 32%. So given that information, what are the obesity statistics? And what I've done is I've taken the liberty to break down obesity statistics in terms of age, separated in children and adults, and then in terms of race and geography. So when we stratify the obesity statistics into age groups, I'm sorry. When we stratify, When we stratify the obesity statistics into age groups, we see that obesity increases as children get older. Now, research suggests that this is related to increased caloric consumption and decreased physical activity, among other things. Further stratification by race shows higher obesity rates among Blacks and Latinos. Now, I would like to highlight something that will become a common theme as we move through this talk, and that is the higher rate of obesity in Black females. Now, it's important that we understand and that we control obesity in young children, because we understand, and the research shows that young obese children become obese adults. So in terms of adults, right now, obesity or overweight encompasses about 70% of US adults. Of that 70%, over 42% of those adults are obese. And when we stratify obesity by age, we see an increase in obesity up to the age range of about between 40 and 59. After which we see a significant decrease. Now, because research shows that there is a linear relationship between increased BMI and death, one could assume that this decrease in obesity is related to attrition caused by death or weight loss due to illness. Further stratification by race shows that, again, Blacks and Latinos have a higher prevalence of obesity when compared to whites and Asians. Again, note that Black women have a significantly higher prevalence of obesity when compared to their white and Asian counterparts. And this is significant, not only because they are the individuals who lead their community in nutrition, are the cornerstones of their community, but they also are the individuals who provide nutrition to their families. Now, what I wanted to do, in addition to breaking this down in terms of age, race, I wanted to look at geography to better understand if this was a systemic or regional problem. So when we look at so this is actually 4 maps of the United States. One breaks down obesity in terms of overall, and then the other 3 break down by race in terms of white, Hispanic, and Latino. And as we look at these maps, it's not very difficult to see which maps are of Hispanic and Black Americans. So when we look at these maps, we see that obesity is not a regional problem. It's not regionally, or it seems to be a cultural and a systemic issue that encompasses our community over the United States. So then you have to ask yourself, why? If it's happening in the South, in the North, in the West, how could it be so widespread and only affect a certain community of individuals? It's systemic, and I believe it's related to education. So why is it important that we control obesity? Again, it increases or it elevates your risk of other diseases. I know that either ourselves or we know someone in our community who has hypertension or high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, which is high triglycerides in the blood, impaired glucose tolerance, which is diabetes or high amounts of glucose in the blood, cardiovascular disease, stroke, certain types of cancer, and then COVID-19. Right now, that is probably the most important thing to us because we are in the middle of a pandemic that is disproportionately affecting minority communities. So how does obesity impact the COVID-19 epidemic? Well, research shows that obesity actually worsens outcomes from COVID-19. One, it may increase your risk of developing COVID-19, and we'll talk about that very shortly in terms of the impact that it has on your immune system. It also increases your risk of severe illness from COVID-19. And then it increases your risk of hospitalization because obesity is associated with impaired immune function. And this is because adipose cells themselves are very inflammatory, and they secrete inflammatory cytokines, which actually augments the effects of the COVID-19 disease or virus. And then obesity decreases lung capacity and ventilation. And we all know, or we should know, that once COVID actually infects or affects your respiratory system, then coming back from COVID at that point is an uphill battle. And then obesity increases the risk of death from COVID-19 as your BMI increases. And we'll see that actually obesity doesn't need COVID-19 to increase your risk of death. And I'm not here to advocate vaccines right now in this talk, but research has shown that being obese actually lowers your body's response to vaccines. And that has been shown in influenza, hepatitis B, tetanus vaccines. So that would lead us to believe that being obese would also reduce your body's response to a COVID-19 vaccine. So again, obesity is associated with increased mortality. So what research has shown us is that once your BMI increases past a certain baseline, so does your risk of death or mortality, which is in and of itself is a very important reason for us to reduce obesity, the number of obese individuals in our communities. So what are some risk factors for obesity? Again, as I stated earlier, we've seen an increase in obesity as we've seen a subsequent decrease in self-reported physical inactivity. Data suggests that the rising prevalence of obesity has occurred simultaneously with self-reported decreases in physical inactivity patterns. And when we look at the data suggests that minority communities have the least amount of self-reported physical activity. Physical activity also increases your risk of coronary heart disease, where individuals who are physically inactive are 1.5 to 2.4 times more likely to develop coronary heart disease. And then less active, less fit people are almost 50% at a higher risk of developing hypertension. Another risk factor is an unhealthy diet. High caloric, low nutrient foods that are high in saturated, trans fat, sodium, simple carbohydrate, what we call low density foods, put every individual at a higher risk of obesity. Eating until you're full, right? Not planning out your meals, not portioning your meals also leads to obesity. And then eating to your full actually also leads to you eating less frequently. And eating less frequently also leads to or increases your risk of being obese or overweight. So why are minority populations at a higher risk? Well, research suggests that we tend to be concentrated in areas with poor socio-environmental conditions. And so when you think about your built environment, if your built environment is not conducive to you going outside to be able to take a walk or walk your dog or be physically active, then you're less likely to do so. And especially if you have the threats of violence in your community. And for that reason, individuals in low socioeconomic environments tend to be less active. On average, we eat larger meal portions and consume high calorie, low nutrient foods. And that could be, again, a byproduct of being from or in a low socioeconomic environment. And it also could be due to lack of access, right? So we go into a lot of what you'll know about a lot or may not know about a lot of low socioeconomic environments. They don't have grocery stores readily available that carry nutritious foods. And then those that do could tend to be too expensive. And then lastly, we receive less medical care. And again, this could be associated with a low socioeconomic environment. It could also be due to lack of trust, low education. And these are things that, once again, that I think that we have to resolve from within our community. So how can the obesity trend be reversed? I think President Obama ran on this term for over 8 years, and it's one that still resonates in my mind. It's one word: we have to change. Not only do we have to change the way that we think, but we have to change the way that we behave. My mom used to say something to me when I was a kid. She said, to know better is to do better. So we have to know better. And in knowing better, we must become better. So how do we change? We have to increase our awareness. We have to increase our awareness that there is a reason why we as a community are at a higher risk for almost every disease that comes out, every virus that comes out: obesity, COVID-19, heart attack, hypertension. Why are we as a community always at a higher risk for these diseases, for these viruses? Once we make ourselves aware, we then have to do what the My Brother's Keeper platform is doing for us right now. We have to go out and we have to make our community aware. And then our community has to act. We have to increase our education. We have to better understand healthcare and how the healthcare system works both for us and against us. And then we have to educate ourselves about those community organizations that are out there and make these resources available to us. But then we also have to understand our temples and what we are putting in them. Once we educate ourselves on that, we then have to go out and educate our communities. And then lifestyle modifications. Again, when to know better is to do better. We have to change the way that we eat. We have to find ways to be physically active. We have got to hold a certain level of importance on nurturing our bodies. We have to modify our behaviors. And I mean our everyday behaviors. I hear a lot that I have a genetic predisposition to something, or I have this because my grandmother had it, and her mother had it, and her mother or my uncle has it. But how much of that is genetic, and how much of that is us passing down environmental cues? And the environmental cues that we're passing down are what's causing us to be predisposition to these illnesses. We have to take accountability for our actions. In terms of nutrition, there are ways to prevent weight gain. Consuming smaller meals, not eating refined processed sugars, reducing your fat intake or changing the type of fat intake, understanding that fat from nuts are a lot healthier than animal fats. And in our community, we tend to consume a lot of meat. Weight loss is a completely different bag, because once you understand that once your body puts on weight, it doesn't want to give it back, especially fat, because fat acts as a reserve. So your body doesn't want to let that fat go. So you have to trick your body into losing that fat. And to do that, you have got to expend more calories than you take in. And to do that, you have to quantify how many calories you're taking in, how many calories you're expending. I used to tell my clients all the time, if you're not quantifying, you're not trying. And I know that it's laborious to count calories, but unfortunately, once you put yourself in a position where you're in a position where you have got to lose additional weight, you got to start counting the calories. And then in terms of physical activity, there are recommendations or guidelines for us to go by. So when we look at children 3 to 5 years of age, those individuals should be physically active throughout the day. For growth and development. And then adolescents age 6 through 17, the recommendations is 60 minutes or more of moderate to vigorous intensity activity. And then 3 of those days should include some type of muscle building activity, climbing, jumping, doing push-ups, something like that. And then for adults, the recommendation is to perform 30 or more minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, 5 or more days per week. For weight loss, it's a little more, and this is a recommendation, but again, in order to lose weight, you have got to expend more calories than you take in. And then these are some behavior modifications that we can do in our daily lives. Taking public transit, drinking 100% juices, natural juices in place of sugary beverages, or in place of sodas. Water, more water. You have got to drink water. So what are the benefits of treating obesity? Improvement in multiple obesity-related factors, all of the ones that we just named, all of the comorbidities that are associated with obesity, a decrease in morbidity or the money that's associated with obesity or is paid out because of obesity, and mortality, and then improvement in health-related quality of life. And again, a decrease in health expenditures. So I'd just like to end by saying, again, thank you to my brother's keeper for giving me this opportunity to educate my community. I believe once again that it takes this. We have got to be more aware of our bodies and what's going on in our bodies. And again, we have got to do the action has to come from within our communities. And we can't continue to wait for the cavalry to arrive, for outside help to come in and relieve us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cole, for that wonderful presentation, learning more about diet, nutrition, exercise, all the effects of COVID-19. We greatly appreciate you and your message. Wonderful information. And again, we have tons of questions coming in, and we will get to those questions shortly. But first, we're going to continue on with our program. And it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce two speakers, Dr. Natalie LeBlanc. Dr. LeBlanc's 17-year career in public health nursing and health research investigates the ecological, cultural, and systemic factors, social detriments of health that influence health specialists. She's able to critically assess health issues from both the public health and clinical perspectives, globally and domestically. As a nurse researcher, she seeks to address and investigate determinants of health disparity, assets within these factors that can be leveraged towards achieving health equity to inform intervention implementation. And along with Dr. LeBlanc, we have Dr. Carolyn Jacobs. And Dr. Jacobs received her undergraduate bachelor's degree in biology from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Jacobs earned her medical degree from SUNY Upstate Medical University at Syracuse. She completed her residency in pediatrics at Albany Medical Center, followed by a fellowship in adolescent medicine at U of R Medical Center. While training during her fellowship, she also earned her master's degree in public health from the University of Rochester. Upon completion of her fellowship, Dr. Jacobs joined the pediatric group at Rochester General Hospital. She enjoys working with children and young adults of all ages. She's had the pleasure of working with a very diverse population during her career, including refugees, the LGBTQ youth, urban and suburban youth, along with deaf and hard of hearing young adults. Dr. Jacobs has learned from every group with whom she has had the pleasure to interact with. And I'd like to introduce first Dr. Jacobs, who will focus on lifestyle choices and its impact on health. Doctors, ladies, thank you for joining us. Dr. Jacobs, welcome.
Thank you. So I will put my screen up here to share. So generally when I give presentations and talks, I always like to start off with case scenarios, because in everyday life, a lot of the things that we see are applicable to so many different people. So with this, I will begin. My first person is an 18-year-old young man who comes in and he informs me that he has felt a bump just above his left testicle. And he's concerned and he actually wants to know what this bump is. The second case is a 13-year-old young lady who actually comes in with her mother. To my surprise, I did not realize what they were there for. There was no information given ahead of time, so I walk in the room and can feel the tension. It turns out that this young lady is there to get a pregnancy test. I learned from her mom that she has secretly been in an abusive relationship. This young man has verbally and physically abused her, and she is of the essence that if she ends up being pregnant, that she will be able to keep this young man in her life. So with that, I will present to you the ABCs of sexual health in adolescents and young adults. So a few things, how I like to proceed. I always like to ask young people, who are you getting your advice from? We'll go into that. Then we're going to talk about the body itself. We'll also talk about contraception. And then the last topic will be about the do's and don'ts of sexual health in young adults and adolescents. So my question, I always ask, who are you getting your advice from? And who are trustworthy resources? So I'm just listing a few. Some people like to talk to their friends. I always say proceed with caution because not all the information your friends give you is accurate. For example, you can't get pregnant on the first time. I like to remind my young ladies that is definitely a myth and that's not true. People can talk to family members. As what was discussed earlier, sometimes generational curses are present and the mother may not want her daughter to actually have to go through a teenage pregnancy. There may be some mentors in your life who are either personal or professional mentors. And sometimes my young adults who are involved in activities and my teenagers who play sports, I actually rely heavily on their coaches because there are some things that can impact your health. A case in point is that young man who presented to me with the lump on his testicle. I have to find out what that is because if there's an issue with his testicle, that's definitely something that his coaches want to know depending upon what sport he's playing and if there's risk to his body because of that. And then lastly, please don't forget about us as the clinicians. I really try and keep a very open relationship with all of my patients. I respect their privacy. They do know they have rights of confidentiality, and they know that if there's any issues that they want to discuss with me privately, they can. And then I do like to remind them that if I have a concern for their safety or I feel they're putting someone else at risk, that unfortunately is when the confidentiality barrier has to be removed. The next element I wanted to talk about is body itself. Obviously, as an adolescent, as you're going through different stages, there are different changes that one sees in their body from different stages of puberty. From the young male who appreciates that his voice is cracking and that he's growing hair in different places and that he may have an odor that he did not appreciate a few years ago. Also, same with my young ladies. There are some young ladies who do not necessarily appreciate their breasts may be going faster than what they would like, but that is their reality at that time. So there are significant changes that they go through. But I encourage my young people to have a positive body image. And if you ask me, what does a good body image look like? The key is that you take care of your body. As was previously mentioned, it's really important to exercise and to eat healthy. It's also important to accept your body as it is. There are times when people will have cultural biases and cultural norms where they feel that it's okay to be big boned, and people will accept that. I really want my young people to understand that they don't have to live up to a particular celebrity's body image. They don't have to live up to social media references. They need to live up to a healthy body and mind. So accepting your body as it is. Also, I want my young people to feel good about what their body can do because wow, they can go out, they can be active, they can be very, very involved in their communities. And most importantly, I want them to be okay with what they see and who they see in the mirror. That is really a huge issue because we do know, we don't talk about it much, but there are eating disorders in our young people. And it's really, really significant. That was one thing that I did a lot of during my fellowship, was work with young women and men who struggle with eating disorders. So it's really important that you do have some self-confidence and that you believe in who you are and what you represent. And your body is your temple. And I firmly believe that. And I encourage my young people to definitely be aware of what's going on with their bodies. So I routinely ask my young people, my young males, I say to them, do you check your testicles once a month? And of course, my first patient that I mentioned, he actually does do that because that's how he felt that lump. I would not have done that unless he was in for his physical, and he had already had his physical for that year. So I appreciated that he did follow up on the recommendation to check your testicles every month. And with that, I remind all of my young ladies, I tell them, make sure you examine your breast. Yes, there are guidelines that say, when you're older, that's when you do it. There are specific age limits, but I encourage my young ladies to know their bodies, because the first time that something's going to go wrong, you may be the one who finds it, or your partner. So it's really important to know all about your body. You need to know what makes you feel comfortable and what doesn't make you feel comfortable. So the body is really important. Next, I'll talk about contraception. That is our C, obviously. So there are definitely many, many options. And contraception, also most people call it birth control. People have all their different jargon and references as to what different types of contraception are out there. So I kind of came up with some of the jargon for the different options. One, abstinence, and I'll go through each of these individually pretty quickly. The patch, there's the pill, there's the infamous ring, there's the shot, there's the implant, and the one that's not really talked about enough is the IUD. So what are all these things? Abstinence. That was a big push during a couple of presidencies ago, where the goal was to have all young people just say no. That is a great standard. We need young people to feel comfortable and to feel that they can say no. And abstaining and not having sex until you are ready, until you are in a marital relationship, in a long-term relationship, that is an important decision that you make. The beauty of abstinence is that your risk of contracting STDs is 0. Next up, we have the patch. The patch is composed of the 2 hormones that help regulate our sexual health, estrogen and progesterone. And that patch actually gets worn by young ladies, and they will change that out every week for about a month. And that can be an effective method. But one of the things you just learned about obesity, if a young lady is above 198 pounds, the effectiveness of that patch diminishes. So that is one thing that you have to talk to young ladies about. The pill. Most people are very familiar with the pill. That was probably one of the most common forms of contraception that people were using. And the key is to remember to take it. I remind all my young ladies, if you can remember to put your pill next to your toothbrush or put it next to your phone, which is something that's always with you, you can set an alarm to remind you to do it. The ring is actually just what it sounds like. It is a silicone ring, and it actually gets inserted into one's vagina, and that can stay in there for a month, and the woman would remove it that last week of the month so that she can have her period. The shot, also, a lot of young people know that as Depo-Provera. This one has probably the most negative connotations around it in our community, and that young ladies will come in and they tell me, oh my gosh, my friend's hair fell out, oh, my friend gained 50 pounds, oh my God, the acne got worse. And a lot of those side effects are very true. To the extent and the severity, that is definitely individually dependent. The implant, that is a little device, and it is about the size of a matchstick, and it goes right underneath the skin in a young lady's arm, and it can be in place for up to 3 years to help protect her from getting pregnant. Going back to the shot, that also is a progesterone only. So those two will actually have higher risk of young ladies saying that they're having a lot of bleeding in between their periods, or they're not seeing their periods at all. So that's a lot of variability. The last topic that I wanted to talk about are IUDs. An IUD stands for an intrauterine device. So that means that that device actually gets inserted through a young lady's vagina and goes in her uterus, and it will be there to help prevent a fertilized egg from being attached to the uterus so that the woman cannot get pregnant. IUDs actually originally were not recommended for young people, and the reason was the thought that adolescents had such risky sexual behaviors and that they did not use barrier protection, and that is the option that we do have there, is condoms for both men and for women. And it's important that young people know how to use them and never be ashamed to ask how to use them. Make sure that they are not out of date and make sure that they are intact. The goal, again, is to not become pregnant. But I also have to remind all of my young people, like I mentioned with abstinence, these contraceptive methods, aside from condoms, they cannot protect you from getting a sexually transmitted infection. That is the last thing you want. I know Dr. LeBlanc is going to talk a little bit more about some specific sexually transmitted infections. So it's really important that you protect yourself. So even if I have a young lady who's telling me that she's on the pill and she says, well, my boyfriend doesn't like condoms, I recommend that she really think about using a barrier protection, because that's important. You don't want to get caught out there and have an infection that can cause you significant problems later on in life. On this slide here, I know it's very, very wordy. It's a lot, but it just lists those different methods that we talked about. And it talks about the amount of times that it may actually have a problem. So with abstinence, if you look at how many couples using this method will get pregnant in a year, there are none, because if you're not having sex, that possibility is gone. You see the implant and the IUD, there are fewer than 1 out of 100 women who get pregnant. So when you look further down, you will see that that area, the implant and the IUD, are the two most common contraceptive methods that have the lowest rate of a woman becoming pregnant. So with that being said, this is a means to really promote implants and IUDs for young people. I always remind young ladies that choice is yours, but these are ones that we are now highly recommending because they are very effective. And if you look at that third column there, it does talk about how effective and to what degree effectiveness these individual things will have. A couple of things that I did leave off, the morning after pill or emergency contraception, that is just what it is. It's emergency. So let's say a young lady is having a relationship and her and her partner decide that they want to have sex, and unfortunately no one has a condom. They still proceed. A young lady has up to 72 hours where she could go to a pharmacy if she's over the age of 18, or she could go to her clinician, she could go to Planned Parenthood, and she could ask to have that morning after pill. If you take it within that first 72 hours, it significantly decreases your risk of becoming pregnant. We talked about the condoms. Diaphragms really are not available here like that in the US. They were definitely used earlier on during the 60s and the 70s. Spermicides, those really aren't used either. They definitely aren't used really with condoms because they can cause breakdown of the condoms, which we definitely don't want. Fertility awareness is, again, for a young lady who knows her body well. That means that she knows when her most fertile time of the month is. That means she knows when she has a greater risk during her menstrual cycle period of when she could become pregnant. So a lot of young ladies, if they know, this is definitely something that older women may do, but now that they have these great, fantastic apps, Your app will tell you if that is a high risk time for you to become pregnant, so you may want to avoid having sex during that time. Then there is also the infamous pull-out method that does not work very, very well. So I do encourage my young people to really not consider that much of an option. If it's a last resort, understand, but then you can always go back and know that emergency contraception is available. And then obviously sex without any birth control. A lot of people can get pregnant with that. And in this report here, it's 85 out of 100 women. And then lastly, I just wanted to bring up the do's and the don'ts when it comes to sexual health. And things that you need to do is always, always respect yourself. Because if you respect yourself, then you'll demand nothing less than anyone else giving you respect. Because you are your best advocate, and you need to understand that. You need to trust your instinct, because if something is telling you this is not right, this is not the right person, this is not the right time, that inkling is generally correct 9 out of 10 times. So always trust your gut. Also, as was mentioned earlier, utilize some reliable resources. So the CDC is a great website. They have plenty of information about sexually transmitted infections. There are also great resources on various agency websites. Planned Parenthood has great information, and there are other major organizations, for example, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Physicians. All those have resources for young people when it comes to contraception, when it comes to sexual health. Those resources are available. And most importantly, ask questions. If you don't know, there is no harm. I like to tell my young people, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Of course, many people will disagree with me. I've had many of my parents who are educators and teachers in the classroom, and they tell me, oh no, Dr. Jacobs, there are stupid questions. But I say to my young people and to my parents of younger children, if you feel that it's a stupid question, I have not made you comfortable enough so that you can ask it, because anything is fair game. Obviously, it's important because it's on your mind, and my job is to help you. Key things to walk away with: don't let anyone talk you into something that you do not want to do. Never feel pressured to do something. You have to take care of you first. And if you're feeling that someone is making you do something against your will, you definitely need to pull yourself out of that situation, reach out to someone. And I know it's not easy when young people are victims of violence in relationships, and it's interpersonal relationships. It is very, very challenging. But my hope is that you young people will have an adult respected who you trust and you feel comfortable with. And I also hope that you can identify with a clinician, or even sometimes young people have providers that they know at Planned Parenthoods or at teen clinics where they feel comfortable, so that you can find a safe space. Also, I don't want you to make assumptions about what people's intentions are, because you really don't know. You have to ask. Don't lose your identity. Again, know who you are, know your body, and know what makes you feel good and what does not make you feel good. And then do not proceed to have any type of relationship, any type of sexual interactions without your consent. That goes back to don't let anyone talk you into doing something that you do not want to do. Please know that there are safe spaces out there, and that definitely applies to my LGBTQ community as well. That rainbow sticker that identifies a safe zone, please utilize them. We are there. We are advocates for you. So never feel that you don't have a place to turn. Rochester is a great region to have healthcare providers. Some areas, definitely, there are not enough of us, but we are very fortunate in our community to have several physicians of color in pediatrics. Unfortunately, most of us are female, so we're looking to hopefully recruit some young males. But it's really important to know that we are here and we are willing to work with you. We are your partners in this journey. So with that, I just say thank you very much for offering me this invitation to present to you guys this afternoon.
This time I'd like to transition and introduce Dr. LeBlanc.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to speak briefly about sexual health and wellness and lifestyle considerations. So why sexual health? Sexual health is an integral part of our overall health and wellness. I like to think of sexual health as being where we were with mental health 10 to 20 years ago. We really need to understand a bit more about how this is really part of our overall health and how having a healthy sexuality allows us to live an overall well-meaning life. Why sexual health? Many people are sexually active. Just remembering that sex should be consensual, people should not feel obligated, it should not be forced, and it definitely should not cause pain. It is an opportunity to have pleasure, to increase bonding and intimacy with the person that you're with. Sexual trauma is related to many adverse life experiences though. Especially childhood sexual trauma is more common than we like to think. And it does have an effect later on in life. Also, sexually transmitted infections specifically have lifelong implications with regards to cancer development later in life, infertility or low birth or preterm infants, and also mental health as well. So stats at a glance, 8% of new HIV and syphilis infection in the US are among males, and close to half are among very young adults. So these are people coming out of adolescence. Couple-based transmission of HIV is very common. For example, and we see this across different sexual orientations and racial groups. But for example, heterosexual contact with partners known to be HIV infected accounted for over 40% of HIV infections among males and over 50% of infections among females. Over 50% of chlamydia and gonorrhea cases are among people among young people specifically, across different sex groups. So again, your older adolescents and young adults. Nationally, over 10% of women and men report having concurrent sexual partnerships. Additionally, there's increasing acceptance in consensual non-monogamy. However, challenging sexual health and wellness is stigma. We still are very uncomfortable having conversations and honest conversations around sexual health and wellness, around sexually transmitted infections. And this prevents people from getting screened, going into treatment, and having, again, honest conversations within communities and within with their partners. So the National Coalition for Sexual Health have outlined 5 action steps to good sexual health. The first being value who you are and deciding what's right for you. Get smart about your body and protect it. Treating your partners well and expecting them to treat you well. Building positive relationships and making sexual health part of your healthcare routine. Condom use remains to be one of the most effective ways of preventing all sexually transmitted infections and in preventing pregnancy, so it has a dual purpose. One of the challenges, however, with that is that the male condom tends to be used most commonly. And so what that requires is that people particularly in heterosexual relationships or same-sex male relationships, being comfortable having conversations with their male partner about using condoms. Not everyone may be used to using condoms consistently, or access may be an issue in some instances. In cases where people may not use condoms consistently, routinized HIV and STI screening is recommended. It is recommended that people get tested for HIV at least every year, or with at least once in their lifetime, excuse me, but also with every new partner. And because with a lot of other sexually transmitted infections, there may be symptoms going on along with that, being screened regularly for that as well is important. The modalities have expanded. So there used to be just individual testing. Now there's couple-based testing in which you and your partner can get tested together, learn of your results together, and therefore plan accordingly as a couple. There's also home-based testing if people, particularly during this time of COVID, if people do not want to go in and go into a health facility, they can order a home-based test kit for sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. And also, because our sexual repertoire keeps expanding, it is recommended that swabbing and testing just of the urethra is not enough. It's also recommended that anal screening and oral screening occurs as well. Also, post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV prevention is very specific for HIV prevention. If someone believes that they have been exposed, taking post-exposure prophylaxis will reduce the probability of contracting HIV, and is only specific to HIV, not other sexually transmitted infections. For the next 3 bullets, I'm going to move forward in the slides. We have pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is also an HIV prevention medication for people who do not have HIV. When taken as indicated, is very effective in reducing HIV development. However, it does not prevent against other sexually transmitted infections nor pregnancy. And it does require that people take a pill every day and see a healthcare provider every 3 months. So even with that, we can foresee that there'll be some challenges. However, there is research going into long-acting PrEP, meaning, and also looking into other modalities besides using a pill. Another approach to sexual health and wellness is vaccination. You might have heard of human papillomavirus, or also known as HPV. And this vaccine was first licensed in 2006 and focused on adolescent girls. The intent was to reach young women before they became sexually active. HPV, certain strains do result in cervical cancer, and cervical cancer can metastasize in the body, commonly becoming breast cancer. So, this vaccine is very helpful to not only preventing HPV, but also the development of certain types of cancers. Over the years, it has expanded to who this vaccine can be used by. Males were added in 2009, and in 2019, it was extended for those aged 27 to 45. I wanted to talk about a little bit about expedited partner therapy, because it is a way to ensure that partners are also tested if someone tests positive for any sexually transmitted infection, including HIV. Unfortunately, it's not offered throughout all of the 50 states, but it is an opportunity to be honest with your healthcare provider and ensuring that not only you are treated for whatever infection, but your partners are as well. And that again requires having honest conversations with your clinicians, but then also it's in the spirit of simply respecting yourself, respecting your partners, and really utilizing this service to prevent community transmission. Lastly, I do want to talk about relationship and sexual agreements. It turns out to be a research area of mine. A relationship sexual agreement is an explicit mutual understanding between 2 or more partners about sexual behaviors, expectations, norms that are agreed to, and that within the couple or outside of the relationship. Unfortunately, however, it's mainly documented among male white couples. It is understudied among other key populations. However, research is showing that other key populations find this to be a useful approach. And so in a relationship or sexual agreement, so depending on the relationship type, will influence the type of agreement. Couples can decide whether there are other partners that are participating in their relationship. It can also include the use of pre-exposure prophylaxis. The agreement can also include whether how often HIV testing or other STI testing is occurring. And it really requires the courage to have conversations around preferences. So to close, sexual health and wellness, about sexual health and wellness. Sexual health is about disease prevention, but it's also much more than that. The World Health Organization defines sexual health as a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to one's sexuality. Sexual health requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships. It's the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences that are free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. And for sexual health to be attained and maintained, the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. LeBlanc. And thank you all. I know that we're tight on time, and so I appreciate all of the presenters, Eric Stevens, Dr. Clark, Dr. Burrell, Dr. Cole, Dr. Jacobs, and Dr. LeBlanc for spending some time with us today, spending some time with our community and providing a wealth of information. I know that there are a lot of questions, and we will look to kind of set up a Q&A. I want to strongly encourage, I'm going to put up on the screen here, we do have a wellness survey that I want to strongly encourage the community to fill out. That survey will provide us some information as we continue to plan and prepare for future events. I've also placed my email for those of you that have questions that have not been answered throughout the course of today's presentation. And I'll work with the team here to make sure that we get those answers back to all of you. I also wanted to provide a little bit of time for the doctors to share some of the things that they've got going on within their own respected programs. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn quickly over to Ray Marley to hit on a couple pieces, and then I want to quickly open it up to the doctors, maybe in the order in which we presented, so that we can, if you have anything that you'd like to share with the community, upcoming events, things that are taking place. But I want to assure the group and those out there within our community that this is just one of many. We will continue to plan these throughout the course of the year. And that survey is going to provide a wealth of information for us so that we can plan to meet the needs of the community as a whole. So I'll quickly turn it over to Ray and then to our doctor. Thank you.
Well, first I want to say thank you, and on behalf of MBK Rochester, I want to say thank you to all the doctors who were able to join us this afternoon. I want to thank Eric Stevens for his amazing story and sharing that with us. To our MBK fellow, Yabnel, who we have nothing but the utmost respect for, and we know that he's going to flourish in our shadows, and he is probably going to replace us in the future, which is what we want. Dr. Burrell, Dr. Clark, Dr. Cole, Dr. Jacobs, Dr. LeBlanc, thank you for giving of your time. One of the things that made this very special, it was Black and brown physicians and doctors and sharing messages to our boys and young men of color and being of color. This is what the message is. This is what we have to do for our young men and our younger generation, is to provide platforms like this. I want to say thank you to the MBK team, to Walter and to Don Hunter for your vision. Once again, we couldn't have done it without your vision for this event. And please join us at all MBK events every month. We put them out on our websites. We have it at iDads Rock, our fatherhood engagement group, Rock MBK, our partnership with the city, Rochester City School District, City of Rochester MBK, and to our MBK steering committee. Again, I am just elated about today's event, and I'm going to pass it to my counterpart at the Rochester City School District, Mr. Tony Jordan.
Once again, everything has been said in terms of our appreciation to all the presenters. So I'm not going to talk long, but please, if you can fill out the survey, please do. That'll help inform us going forward. And you can reach out to Ray, Dr. Cotto, or myself if you'd like to connect with us. We certainly are looking to broaden our connection and network so that we can, support the achievement of young men and boys of color, but our achievement of all our students. All this work is community, because as a community, we need to heal and grow. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cotto.
Thank you. And I also we can't forget Tom Mohan, who's behind the scenes working the technology for us. So thank you, Tom, for your continued work and dedication to the RCSD. Quickly, I want to just kind of go in the order of the doctors to just kind of get a feel if there's anything additional that you'd like to share. So I'm going to start with Dr. Clark and then work my way down.
Yeah, no, I don't think I have too much else to share. Just look to hear from us along with Dr. Maria Elena Velez de Brown, our Deputy Commissioner of Health, who would like to talk to everybody more about COVID and the vaccine, because we've got a lot of questions on that. And we're looking tentatively for the week of February 15th. So keep tuned for that. And just be aware that the Black Physicians Network will be putting out a statement this week regarding our opinions about the vaccine. So a source of information.
Thanks so much. Dr. Burrell? You're on mute.
Yes, there we go. Thanks so much, MBK, for this opportunity. And I want to thank the crowd, of course, for allowing me that brief space to share an emotional journey. However, we've been finding that emotional learning is every bit as strong as traditional didactic approaches. With that being said, I want to be clear to make sure that if you're experiencing emotional distress, to seek the care of a licensed mental health provider. With that also being said, I understand, particularly in Black and Brown populations, that mental health is a highly stigmatized topic, and it's important to share the message and learn to be more vulnerable through storytelling, which I tried to do today. Currently, if you're interested in any connection communities for minorities or men looking to learn more about mental health, I am involved in a movement called visibleman.org. That's visibleman.org. And we're developing an online community to discuss mental health topics, particularly stigma and those things pertaining to men, and pointing them in direction of the adequate resources and providers. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Burrell. Dr. Cole?
Yeah, I don't have anything going on. I'm just a bench scientist who spends most of his day in the lab. But what I do want to say, I want to reiterate something that I said earlier, and that's, let's start to educate ourselves more as a community on all things that are health. The vaccine, don't sit around and wait on someone to tell you or to take someone else's opinion. I admonish everyone who's under the sound of my voice to go out and educate yourself. Don't wait for a voice. You be the voice. Be the voice for your community. Be the factual voice. I was speaking to someone the other day and I said, beware of someone who only gives you their opinion and no fact. Seek out the facts. Educate yourself on what the facts are, because you only get one body. You only have one. Let's not depend on others to help us take care of that vessel. Let's help ourselves, and then let's go out and fight for our community.
Thank you. Dr. Jacobs?
Definitely would just highlight that. Take care of yourself first. Be good to yourself, because once you take care of yourself, you will be a better advocate for our community, and we will truly rise up and do all that we need to do to continue to move forward. So thanks.
And Dr. LeBlanc.
Hi, it's Dr. LeBlanc. It was a pleasure. That's great. It was a pleasure speaking with everyone here and seeing all these lovely faces. And yes, you know, our health is part of our being and our essence. And so without that, we're not able to move forward. And we're coming from a culture with a lot of resilience and with a lot of strength and knowledge and ancestral knowledge as well. So we are able to move forward. We're strong people, and yeah, stay safe and sane out there.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of the Rochester City School District, the City of Rochester, MBK, Fatherhood Engagement, and all the other organizations that are supporting this movement here, we want to thank you greatly. And we look forward, hopefully, to doing continued work in this field or in these areas as we continue to navigate in a way to educate our community and making the choices that they need to make as it relates to their overall health and well-being. So thank you all. Have a great rest of the day. And looking forward to continuing this work.
Thank you for your service on Dr. King Day.